The Estes Wizard, one of the most iconic rockets in the Estes fleet, has had over 4 decades of longevity and is one that most rocketeers have either built and flown or have seen others build and fly. Its simple design and snazzy looks have definitely made it one of the favorites for both beginner and experienced modelers alike. Making its debut in the Estes catalog in 1978, this new BT-20 design was sure to capture the eye of any prospective rocket buyer. With its unique purple and white paint scheme and wrapped with a Patriot Stars stripe, it no doubt screamed magic and patriotism all at the same time. With an overall length of 12 inches, it gave the modeler something worthy of being displayed, yet not taking up too much shelf space. Although it comes with a streamer in the kit, one could easily pack a 6-inch parachute, or even a 9-inch if you're courageous enough. Estes kept the same paint and decal scheme on the rocket for 14 years, until 1992. But then in 1993 they made a radical change in the design of the decals and paint. Although the actual rocket design did not change at all, other than transitioning from a balsa nose cone to a plastic one in 1982, but the new look was one that you either loved or hated. In this first part of 2, I will be building the newer version of the Wizard and replicating its face card looks. Although I do modify a few things in the actual building, aside from the instructions, I in no way change the looks of the rocket in either design or color. So sit back and enjoy the build.
Hey everybody, this is Kevin and welcome to the first in a 2-part series I'm going to be doing on the Estes Wizard. As you may know, Estes created the Wizard and it stuck with its original paint scheme for about 15 years, 10 to 15 years, and then they made a dramatic change in its look and color design, but the model rocket itself stayed the same. Same shape, same length, size, fins, everything was the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this into 2 videos where I'm going to build the newer version of it, which will look like this, and then the older version of it, which we consider the vintage classic look. The build itself is going to be identical to both. The only difference is going to be when we come to the decals and the painting. That's going to be where it's different. Now for the sake of this build, I want to show you, this is what it's going to look like when it's done. This is my current Wizard, and this is my flying version. This has been pretty abused and beaten up through all its flights, but it's still in one piece somewhat and still flying. But this is what we're going to end up with this kit when we're done. But for the sake of this one, it's not going to be a flying model. Now I'm going to build it to fly. I'm just going to keep it on the shelf as what we like to call as a shelf queen. And I'm probably going to do that with the vintage one as well. But I do want to implement some building styles in this that I'm going to show you that are a little bit different than the instructions, although it's going to come out looking like an original would. So quick glance at the instructions, kind of give us a quick inventory. We do have our body tube, we've got our shock cord, which for flying sake I would use Kevlar, but since this is not going to be a flying model, I'm going to go ahead and use the rubber cord that came with it. We have our 16th inch balsa fins, and what's different about these are we're going to paper the fins, and I'll show you in detail how I do my papering on balsa fins. And we have a body tube spacer for the motor, and then we've got our nose cone, and just plastic PNC right there. And now for this one also I'm going to make a little bit different with the decals. I'm not going to use the stock decals. I scanned them into my computer and I printed them out on some water slide decals. I prefer water slide over the adhesive back because they give you a little more adjustability and they're thinner. So when it comes down to laying down the gloss coat, they'll pretty much eliminate any ridge you have. Although, well, if you use the adhesive back, they're pretty thick, and even after you gloss coat it, it's still going to have a bit of a ridge. So we're going to try that out as well. Color should be the same. It should look good. And when we get to that point, if they don't look good, I'll peel them off and then we'll go with the adhesive back. But for now, we're going to stick with that plan. So let's go ahead and zoom in closer, and we're going to start building. Okay, the first thing we're going to start to work on is the fins. And as I told you in the intro, we're going to paper these fins, which will enable us to go ahead and build it up, paint it without ever having to fill in the grain, because the paper will lay down a nice surface, which in essence is like filling in the grain. And it's a good surface for the primer to stick to as well. So it doesn't absorb the paint into the wood as much because it creates that barrier. So the first step we need to do is make sure all 3 fins are equal and identical to one another. This kind of fell apart in the kit, but that's okay. What I'm going to do is just take my X-Acto knife and cut the little tabs that have been holding it together. And this is very soft balsa, so these are cutting very, very easily. Just snip those little tabs off. Like so. And discard the scrap pieces. And then we just want to put all 3 of these together, sandwich them together, and we're going to take a sanding block, and for one, we're going to sand off those little tabs that we just snipped off, and then 2, we're going to sand a little bit further down to get to all the flat surfaces and make sure that they're all equal to one another. So at the end, we'll have 3 identical pieces. So kind of pinch them together with your fingers, hold them tight, and then just run them over a sanding block. Now this is some 220 that I'm using, which is just strong enough to bite through the wood but not to take off too much. So there we go. That is maybe a little bit on the bottom end there. Okay, so those are all 3. Now when you pinch them, make sure you don't ever lose that connection. Okay, let's do the larger surfaces, the leading edge and the trailing edge first. And when you do this, you want to make sure you're holding it perpendicular to the sanding block. If you're holding it like this, you're going to get unevenness amongst the 3 fins. Okay, that's good. The other thing too is it takes off that kind of burnt. You see how this is lighter than that dark burnt? That's just the soot that's left over from the laser cutter. Okay, and we'll do the root edge. This is the edge that's going to be actually glued to the body tube. Okay, good. And last is our tip. And this should be pretty quick. This is a small edge. You'll notice when you have smaller pieces, if you're trying to sand that direction, you can get a rolling effect, which you got to really be careful not to do. So if you hold it 90 degrees to the surface, you keep that flatness and that squared edge a lot easier to hold that edge. There we go. So now we got 4 equal sides sanded down, so we have 3 equal fins. Alright, so the next step is we're going to paper these fins, and I'm going to show you how I do my technique here in the next section. Okay, the first step in papering fins is obviously getting your paper. Now this is just a standard piece of copy paper. I pulled it right out of my printer. And what I like to do is, because we've got 2 sides to the fins, and what I like to do is create a straight edge on one of them. So I'm going to use this straight edge here, and to duplicate both sides, I'm simply going to fold my paper in half. That way I can basically make 3 cuts for 3 fins, but then I'll have all 6 pieces that I need. So now I've got 2 straight edges lined up together. Now what I like to do is lay my fins, and I want to leave a little overlap of about 1/16 of an inch, and what that does is I'm only going to glue the paper up to within a 1/16 of an inch of the root. That way when it comes to time to lay down the fillet, the glue for the fillet is actually going to be adhering to the wood, not the paper. Give you a little bit extra strength there. But it'll overlap the paper just enough where it'll, keep the paper down. So I just kind of overlap it, like I said, about a 1/16 of an inch. And very crudely, I just draw a very rough overlapping cutout. Then using that same line on that side, I'm just going to draw this out and around there. And then do it one more time. And there are my 3 cutouts. And again, it's going to be 6 because I've got the bottom piece that's going to cut. So then we just take our scissors do our cut. So now we've got 2 pieces there. And again, this can be very rough. If you cut outside the lines, it's absolutely not a big deal. So there's 2 more. And 2 more. So 2 things you want to keep in mind is you want to keep that at least one straight edge that's going to glue up close to the root. And then enough overhang that we're going to be able to cover the whole surface of the fin. So now we've got, some scrap paper that's, trash at this point. So this is all we're going to need now is these 6 paper fins that are, as you can see, larger than the fin itself. Okay. Now the next thing we want to do is mark on the fin a line of about 1/16 of an inch, and this can be done. Let me just grab a small ruler. This can be done just by eyeballing it. You don't have to actually measure out a 1/16 of an inch. Just kind of, use your eyesight, and with a pencil, just draw a quick line down each side. And what this does is it gives us a line, we'll run the paper up to, but it also gives us a line to take our glue up to, so we don't put glue over that line. Because we want to keep the wood open and porous to accept the fillet when we get down to that point. Yeah, I'm just eyeballing this. You could get crazy and measure a 1/16 of an inch, but this has always been close enough. And one more side. Okay, so now the next step is we're going to actually apply the glue. And what I like to do too is when I glue it down, and I'll show you in the process, but I take a 1/4 inch piece of plywood with a wax paper sheet over it, put the fin down with the paper on it after it's been glued, and then sandwich it between another piece of wax paper and another 1/4 inch piece of plywood with heavy weight. Sometimes I use an ammo can full of ammo, or just heavy books, whatever you have that's heavy that can squish that plywood and make a sandwich out of it, which will do 2 things. It'll really compress the paper into the wood, but 2, it'll keep it from warping on you. You want it to dry nice and flat. So let me get the plywood out and we'll start papering. Okay, so now we're all set up to do our first fin, and I used Type Bond 2 wood glue. I see that wood glue seems to work better than white glue. For whatever reason, I just had a little bit more luck with the bonding of the wood glue. Now the trick is, and I'll show you how I do this, the trick is after you apply the glue to the fin, you want to remove as much of it off as you can. If you leave little puddles or pools of glue, what that's going to do is it's going to oversaturate the paper, and cause it to wrinkle up and crinkle on you, and then it won't lay down flat or smooth, and it just turns into an absolute mess. So once we apply the glue, I'm going to take a popsicle stick and just scrape off as much as I can. And trust me, there's going to be enough glue left on the wood to absorb into the paper and create that bond. But people, tend to over glue it. And I did that early on, and I wondered why I was getting bad results. It's because I was using way too much glue. So now these are pretty small fins, so this should go pretty quickly. So all you really do is just take your fin, apply a little bit of glue, and then just with a popsicle stick start spreading it out. Now run it up very close to that line. I like to do that first because it's a little bit more, requires a little more precision. And make sure you put enough glue on there so you've got glue to work with. You don't want to run short. And then once you get up to that line, then just sort of pull it down and just cover the whole surface of the fin. Now again, this I used more than I needed, but that's okay. And always have a paper towel on hand which I got right here, and then just take your stick and just scrape it off. Wipe it onto your towel. Okay, looks like there's still some pretty wet spots, so I'm just going to drag it again. Just keep dragging it off until it's pretty much all gone. Now see, you can't see any glue on there, maybe a little glint here and there. And then you just take your paper, line it up to that line that you drew, lay it down. Make sure you've got coverage all the way around, which we do. And then you take your plywood with your wax paper. I lay that down like that. Take another sheet of wax paper. Lay it down. Take another piece of plywood. Just like that. And then, again, I use an ammo can because it's really heavy. But, you know, use heavy books, whatever you've got. And just lay it on there and just let it do its thing. And then while it's on there, you can go ahead and start to do your next fin. Simply remove everything, lay your next fin in there, put the weight back on it. Again, the ammo can is probably overkill. Heavy books will work just as well, but that's the way I've been doing it, and it seems to work out fine. And that's all there is to it. Now, once these dry, give it, half hour to an hour. There's no rush. Take it off, remove them, and then I'll show you when we get to that point. I'll do the other two fins, and we're going to trim the paper off with an X-Acto knife up to the edge, and then we're going to glue the other side of the paper on. So I'll do the other two off camera, and I'll come back to you after they've dried and we can cut the paper off. Okay, while we're waiting for the first set of fins to dry with the paper, we can go ahead and take this opportunity to make our marks for our fin locations and launch lug locations on the body tube. Now, if you want to use the fin guide that comes in the kit, you're more than welcome to. That works just as well. The advantage to that over what I'm about to show you is it will give you an absolute indicator as to where the launch lug goes. My way, you're going to sort of have to eyeball it. But what I like to do is use this Estes fin tube guide to mark the locations. Now we're running a 3-fin setup, so you got to make note of the 3 locations on the top post there that we're going to use. But simply slide your body tube on the post and just make your marks where the little notches are. One, 2, and 3. Just like that. So now we've got 3 marks at the base of the tube, and then I'm going to get my other favorite Estes tool, this line guide, and I'm just going to put the mark I made right on the line there, and then just draw a line a few inches up, rotate it, go to the next mark. And our third and final mark. Okay. Now, when I said the launch lug is more definite on the fin guide, it's because now we're just going to have to kind of eyeball it. And this isn't hard to do, but I just kind of like to look overhead between 2 lines and just mark a good center line. And then on this guide, I'm going to draw this line a little bit higher up because the launch lug is not going to be at the base down where the fins are. So just extend that line a little bit higher up. Alright, just like that. Now what I like to do too is before we glue the fins, I'd like to take a scratch piece of sandpaper and just kind of scuff up on the line where we're going to be actually doing the gluing. That gives the balsa fins something to adhere to a little bit better than that glossy sheen that's on the wax of the tube. So there's for the 3 fins, and then for the launch lug, just kind of mark it a little bit higher up where it's going to go. And if you sand through your marks, that's okay. You can go back and remark them. But in this case, I marked them pretty hard, so you can still see them pretty well through the sanding. So there we go. That's all there is to it to marking. Now I'm going to get back to the papering, and once they're done, then we can actually start gluing them onto the body tube. One other thing that we can work on while we're waiting for the glue to dry on the paper is we can install the thrust mount or engine block in the aft end of the body tube. And off camera I did go back and remark those lines a little bit darker because I had sanded a little bit too much off the line, which is fine. Which, you know, that's actually good because we got down to more porous fibers of the cardboard. But I did mark those lines back a little bit darker. And then all we need to do is take the spacer that comes in the kit and make a mark 1/4 inch down from one end. That's going to be the end in which we stop when we're inserting this in. We're going to push it up and stop it right at that mark we made, and then pull it back out. What I like to do is take a Q-tip, because it's the right length to that mark. Is if you pinch one end of the cotton edge and push it all the way into where your thumbnail hits the tube, that's the right distance for where we're going to apply the glue. Now this has to be done rather quickly because this wood glue sets pretty quick. Have your thrust ring ready to go and your spacer ready to go. Again, just sort of pinch one end of the cotton end, and I just apply the wood glue to one end, run it in the back end of the tube, and then just rotate that within the cylinder. Be careful not to touch the tube anywhere behind that point. And let's just do one more application so we know we got full coverage. And you can tell by feel too if you've got enough on there. It's kind of sticky all the way around. Okay, carefully remove that. You can kind of look in there and make sure you do have full coverage, which we do in this case. Take your engine block, get it started, take your spacer and push it in. Now this has to be done very quickly. Get it to that mark and then pull it out so it doesn't catch. There it is, and pull it out. There we go. Perfect. Now we're going to just let that sit and dry, and we move on to the next step. Okay, now we're going to show you what we've got under the plywood here after it's been drying, the papered fins. And sometimes the paper will stick to the wax paper, but that's okay. Better that than the wood. But there you go, and see how clean and smooth it is. We've got our 1/16 inch overlap. So what I want to do is briefly show you how I trim it before we glue the other half on. So just take a sharp X-Acto knife, and using the fin itself as your guide, just cut along the edge. And trim the paper off. There you go. It's literally that simple. Now you got one completed fin. And I'm just going to do the same process I did on the other side, on this side for the other two as well, and we'll be all done. And then after we're done, you can still sand your rounded leading edge into the paper and balsa wood. And also what we're going to do is that when we're done is we're going to run a bead of thin CA glue around the whole perimeter, and that'll help seal the wood as well as help keep that bond between the paper and the wood on the very edges so they don't lift or anything. So there you go. It's really that simple. Okay, one thing I want to briefly talk about before we move on to the next step and while we wait for glue to dry is I want to share with you something that I learned from my good friend Don over at Retro Rockets on scaling your rocket for decal purposes or for painting or anything that addresses the aesthetics of the rocket. What I want to show you is this little chart that I created. and I'll give you a close-up here and show you. So what it is it's a comparison between the picture that you're using for reference and the actual piece of the model. So here I'm using my face card that I printed up. It's a copy of the face card of the Wizard. Now it's a side profile which gives us enough of the right angle to get accurate measurements. And whenever you're measuring, it's a lot easier to do in centimeters because it's easier to divide centimeters than fractions in the standard system. So for example, in the case of the picture, I'm going to measure the entire body tube from the top to the bottom of the tube, and that measures out to be 96 millimeters. Okay, so we're going to put 96 as our picture dimension, and the actual dimension, I'm going to take the tube itself and measure it. I have exactly 220 millimeters. So our picture is 96, our actual is 220. Now there's a multiplier in there that we're going to learn, and we can use that multiplier for all additional dimensions. What you do is you take your picture multiplied by x equals the actual. So the question is, what is x? What is our multiplier? Well, if you divide the actual, the 220, divide it by the picture 96, you're going to get a multiplier of 2.29. So what that tells me is anything now that I measure on the picture, if I multiply that measurement by 2.29, it's going to give me the actual dimensions that I want to use on the body tube itself. So when it comes to decal work, when we come to put the Wizard decal on the body, I'm going to measure, for example, the W to the end of the rocket, and it comes out to 23 centimeters. Okay, so you take your calculator and say 23 times our multiplier, which is 2.29, equals 52.67, or roughly, we'll round it up to 53 centimeters, or millimeters. So then on your body tube, you measure up your 53, right there, and that's going to be the location of the W in Wizard. And that'll accurately give the right ratio as per the picture on the face card. So, and whatever else you want to do, if you had other stripes or decals or striping, or whatever you're putting on your rocket that's on the face card, you can multiply it by 2.29 and it'll tell you where it goes on the actual tube. Okay, so a couple hours have passed, and I went ahead and pulled all 3 fins out from the plywood sandwich. And I went ahead and trimmed up the first 2, but I wanted to save the 3rd one to show you guys what it looks like when it comes out. Again, we already trimmed one side, and you can see that the other side is still, overlapping the edge. So just like we did in the first half, you just take your X-Acto up against the fin as a guide, draw it down, and draw it down, and it should release nicely. So there you go, one completed paper fin. Now what I want to show you is how we seal the edges. Now keep in mind, we need to keep the glue away from the root edge. This is the edge that's going to glue up against the body tube when we get to that stage. So we want to keep that open and porous so the glue will work. So what we want to do is seal the other 3 edges. But before we do that, we need to round the edges. So that's pretty simple to do. You just take a sanding block, and I'll sand this one and glue it, and then I'll do the other 2 off camera for sake of time. But the instructions call for rounding off the leading edge and the tip edge. So we're going to do those 2. And something this small, only 1/16 of an inch, does not take much sanding at all. Now when you sand, you always want to push toward the middle, which is pushing the paper down. If you pull the paper, or pull the sandpaper toward you, it's going to lift the paper off. So we always want to just kind of roll it. So I'm kind of going at a 45-degree angle, but I'm also rolling at the same time. That's just about perfect, actually. That is just about perfect. So, not quite sure how well that's coming up on the camera, but it's pretty darn round. So that's good. And then, like I said, we want to do the tip as well. Okay, nice. Now we want to blow all the dust off before we lay our glue down, because once we lay the glue down, then all those dust particles will remain permanently attached. So we definitely want to, let me do this corner a little bit more first. There we go. Okay, so then you just take a little bottle of thin CA glue. And again, you want to run it around the 3 edges, not the root edge. That's very important. Okay, and you just kind of get it going. And just draw it along the edge. 1. And it'll let it soak into the pores. 2. And 3. There we go. That is literally all there is to it. Now we're going to let this dry, and I recommend you let it dry on a piece of wax paper because it won't adhere to the wax. But if you lay it down on something else, it's going to permanently attach itself to that surface. So I'm going to do the other 2 fins the same way with sanding and gluing. And once we do finish the glue and it's dry, I'm going to let this sit for another hour or 2 to let the CA really cure. Then we can go over it again with the sandpaper, just to kind of smooth it out. But that's pretty straightforward. But you don't want to sand off too much because then you're going to remove all the glue. So just take off that edge, that rough edge that the glue leaves behind. So that's all there is to that. And then we will come back and we should be ready by that point to glue the fins onto the body tube. Okay, we've made it to the time of gluing the fins onto the body tube. I let an hour pass on the CA glue, let it dry, and then just very lightly I went over the edges with some fine sandpaper just to kind of smooth out the rough edges. And so it's good to go. Glue's still there, but it's been smoothed out. Again, the root edge is still open and it's ready to glue down. Now before we glue it, we do need to make some marks on the body tube. The instructions call for mounting the fins 3/8 of an inch up from the bottom of the tube. So what I did was I marked a little notch right there at 3/8 of an inch. And what I want to do is run a band around the whole circumference there to give me an edge. And I'm going to do that with tape. But in order to get the tape straight, I want to wrap a piece of paper first. And I'll show you how I do this here. So take a squared off piece of paper where you know it's square, like so. And let me grab a piece of tape. Make sure I'm doing this on camera for you, sorry if I'm not. Okay, so get that wrapped around so the edges are square to one another. And then just hold that down with tape. So now it's adjustable. So I'm going to slide this up to our mark right there. Just like so. Then I'm going to take some thick masking tape and I'm going to run it right along the edge of that paper. Actually, before I do that, let me tape the paper down to the tube so it's not going to slide around on me. We want it to stay in that position right at the 3/8 inch mark. Okay, now we can lay down our tape. And just make sure you follow the edge of that paper. just like so. Okay, remove this tape, pull your paper back, and now you've got an edge that you can butt the fin up against when you glue it down. So you know all three are going to be matching at the base. The other thing I want to point out is a lot of us modelers will glue our fins directly on top of the line, trying to center it in the front and in the back. Well, the problem is it's hard to square in the back because you can't see where you're putting it down to. So what I have started doing is I will glue the fins to one side of the line so I can still see the line, and then just glue the edge right up to the line where it meets the base of the fin. And if you do the same thing on all three fins on the same side of the line, they're going to be equally matched and spaced out, just as if they were centered on the line. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get our first fin ready. I'll do our first fin on camera, and I'll do the remainder off camera because it's going to be the same technique. And definitely using wood glue. And I want to show you the procedure I use, and I know most of you guys do as well. Just run a thin bead. Always have paper towels on standby. And just with your finger, just kind of rub it in. If you've got too much, you just simply wipe it off. Just like so, nice even coating. Okay, now I've sanded a little more on the left side of each line. So I'm going to keep in mind all three fins are going to go on the left side of the line. So I'm simply going to set this up against the tape, set it down, and then lift it. Now there's a little bit of glue left on the line and still some glue left on the root edge of the fin. We're going to let this sit for about 30 seconds to a minute, and then when we reattach it, its tackiness will hold it in place. So then it'll hold while we do the remainder of the other two fins. Otherwise you're going to be holding this forever and waiting for it to dry, whereas if you give it 1 minute, it'll hold itself. So we'll come back in about 30 seconds. Okay, about a minute's gone by now, and the glue is tacked up. So same as before, I'm going to set the rear end of the fin up against that tape, and just to the left of the pencil line, set it down, press it a little firmly into the cardboard, and voila, it holds its shape. Kind of eyeball it from behind. Make sure you're perpendicular to the tube. You got a little flexibility with it, which is good. Looks good. So that will now hold and harden up a little bit more as I do the remainder. Okay, now that the fins have completely dried on the body tube, I kept the masking tape on the back half on, and I wrapped some masking tape around the front edge as well. And between each set of fins, I ran a piece of 10mm Tamiya tape. And that's going to be our buffer for laying down the fillets. Now, I didn't put any tape on the fins itself, although it would be nice to. I don't want to risk peeling the tape off and peeling the paper with it. So it's just best to leave it alone. I've got rock epoxy mixed up, part A and B, ready to go to lay down the fillets. Now, rock epoxy is super strong. I mean, extremely strong. This is for high power stuff. So why am I putting it on a Wizard? Well, for one main reason, it's a thicker epoxy and it holds its shape and runs fillets a lot nicer than, say, 5 or 15 or 30 minute epoxy. Those are a little bit runnier and won't stay level, whereas rock epoxy, you could angle the rocket vertically, horizontally, doesn't matter, and the epoxy will hold its shape. So it lays down really nice, solid fillets. So I also want to make sure I've got some rubbing alcohol on hand. Whenever you're dealing with epoxy, you always got to have something to clean up with, so we'll set that right there. Yeah, we're all masked off and ready to go. I have one popsicle stick that has a nice clean round edge that I'm going to use to run the fillet itself. So I'm going to use that especially, but I'm going to lay down the initial coat with my mixing stick. Okay, so we're just going to set this down in the groove. Now you'll kind of want to use the popsicle stick to kind of push it into the joint so you don't get any air bubbles. Okay. And it's as simple as, well, you know what, I want to run a little bit more around the leading edge as well. That way we get a nice round leading edge. Okay, so then you take your popsicle stick and you try to do it so you can see on the camera here. Kind of come around the leading edge and then just draw it down, just like so. Just one smooth move like that. Okay. Let me wipe the excess off that stick. Okay. And we'll do the same in this edge here. And I'll show you these two, and then we'll cut the camera, and then I'll show you the completed project when I get all three done. Okay, we've got all three fillets, well, technically 6 laid down. But before it sets up, I want to remove the tape and then use my Q-tips and rubbing alcohol to smooth out the edges a little bit. So let's go ahead and remove all of our masking tape. So 3 center pieces. The nice thing about Tamiya tape in the center is it holds its line really, really well, and obviously it's for painting, and it's the best tape for painting, but it also works really well for holding back epoxy for jobs like this. Okay, now we'll tear off the leading edge. Okay, and the trailing edge. There we go. Okay, now we get to, I'm going to set the epoxy aside so we don't accidentally rub anything into it. I'm going to take my Q-tips, douse them with rubbing alcohol, and just go over the seam line. I'll do the, let's see, I can do it this way first. I know you're not seeing it too well. I'm just going over the edge that it leaves to help blend it into the body on both the fin side and the body side. Okay. And if you think you got too much glue on a Q-tip, get another Q-tip. They're not that expensive. Oh, in fact, I can just soak that up. And we'll turn it around. I know I'm missing a lot of this on camera. I do apologize. Just trying to be expedient about it. And then when all is said and done, you are going to have to come back and clean up the leading edges on all three, because they're kind of chunky with that buildup of epoxy. But that's normal. Okay. think that's all 6. Okay, so now all I want to do is worry about the leading edge. So let me dress those up. And a lot of it, I'm just gonna kind of like a rolling motion. Just kind of rolling the alcohol swab, kind of pulling the leading edge out into the body tube, creating a nice blend that looks natural. Just kind of rolling down the leading edge of the fin itself through the epoxy and then down onto the body tube. There's one that's a little bit beefier than the other two, so I'm actually pulling some of the epoxy off and then just kind of rolling out the remainder. This is kind of an artistic part of building. And at some point you got to know when to stop too. You can just keep doing this all day long until you just ruin it. So at some point you say, you know what, it looks good, I'm going to stop and let it dry. And I'm at that point right now where I'm just going to say stop and let it dry. So there you have it. The fins are done. I'm going to let this dry overnight, and then we will come back and glue on the launch lug and apply fillets the same way with the same epoxy. Okay, this is going to be one of the quicker steps to do. Is we're simply going to glue the launch lug on. But I've set the rocket like this overnight and the fillets dried nicely. I did do a little fine sanding around the edges where they kind of blend into the cardboard just to kind of smooth that out a little bit. The blending wasn't the best, so but I got all that sanded down nice and smooth, so we're good on that front. And I want to show you all, so I went ahead and marked the space we're going to glue the launch lug on. It's exactly 2 inches up from the base of the tube. And then I marked 2 little lines, one at the bottom and one at the top of the launch lug. Now one thing I also did was, I told you before, I kind of eyeballed it. I went in after the fact and I got the little fin guide out and I went ahead and measured exactly between the 2 fins to get that center line using the fin guide that came on the instructions, because it wasn't spot on to my liking. I wanted to make it exact. So anyway, that is now perfectly centered. I'm also going to do the same thing that I did with the fins. I'm going to glue this just offset on the line, just to the left side of the line, to fall in line with the way I glued the fins on. That way it's centered between the fins. So that's the only additional thing. I've gone ahead and pre-sanded a little bit to roughen up the surface. I'm going to take some wood glue and just a simple little strip of glue. Let's see if I get this on camera. Okay. And we're not going to do it like we do with the fins. We're going to set it on and leave it. We're not going to pull it off again. So it's going to go just to the left of the line. So let me set it down and then I can adjust it accordingly. Just eyeballing it from above, making sure it's straight. Okay. Got it from the front. Okay, hopefully you can see that. It's in line. It's not, canted off to the one side or another. It's straight in line with the tube, and it's centered directly between the two fins there. So that is all there is to that. We're going to let that dry. And I may or may not film the fillets on this. I'm going to do the same process as I did on the fins. I'm going to just lay a piece of tape on the fore and aft ends to keep the glue off the tube, and then just a little bit on the sides, and then run a fillet of rock epoxy on either end. I may or may not show that. But really the next step is getting this primered. And once we get it primered, then we can really see what, if anything, we really need to sand down. And we're also going to use the primer to help fill in the spiral grooves in the tube as well. So that's the next step. So let's get to it once this dries. Okay, so we finished with the primer, the first primer coat, and what I'm doing is I'm putting down the gray primer first, and then once we get that sanded down and smoothed up, then we're going to go with the white primer, and then the color coat, which is blue. I want the white behind the blue to give it a little more pop. I'm afraid if I use the gray primer and then the blue, it'll kind of subdue it and darken it a little bit. So I want to do gray, white, and then the base coat of blue. I'm going to zoom in here and show you a close-up. What I plan on doing is, now that the gray primer is dry, you'll start to see the rough spots and the inconsistencies, and that's where you want to kind of smooth those out before the next coat of primer. However, because there's cardboard and paper underneath this layer of primer, I only want to dry sand it. So I'm just going to take some rough 500, well 500 is pretty smooth, but I want to take it and smooth those rough parts down just enough where it can lay down a nice coat of the second primer coat. Once we get the white primer on, then I can wet sand it, because if the wet sand paper goes through the white, the gray primer undercoat will protect the paper and the cardboard. Hope that makes sense. But so with the initial coat, I'm just going to take some 500, sand it down roughly, dry, and then also these subsequent coats of primer will also help fill in the spirals, which are filling in pretty nicely. So I got the main body tube done, as well as the nose cone, and you'll see a close-up of that here. That's pretty much done. I will wet sand. I'm going to go ahead and wet sand it because it's just plastic underneath, and prepare it for the white primer coat. And also I want to show you the launch. The shock cord mount is complete. When I let it sit overnight in the vise, it made it nice and flat. I've already, with my fingers, kind of put in a little bit of a curve to it. I'll show you a zoomed in close shot of that, because that'll help fit inside the body tube a little bit easier. But one big thing I want to mention, this is kind of a big news. I mentioned in the intro that I'm going to be using water slide decals for this because I want to maintain the originals. Well, that's not going to work, and I'll show you why. I went ahead and did a test run on my existing Wizard, and because it's already seen some flights and some battle damage, I had to replace one of the fins already, and when I replaced them, I didn't have the decals to go with it, so I thought that'd be a great test piece to try out a water slide. And as you can see here in this close-up shot, the water slide decal is way too transparent, and the blue backing bleeds through pretty strongly. You can see the difference between the decal, the adhesive back, and the water slide there, and so that's just not going to work. The only way I could get that to work is if I put it on, printed the decal on some white backing, but then I would still have the issue with the clear to see the blue through it. It's getting too complicated trying to figure out how to do that, so I'm going to elect to go with the standard decals that came with it. They're tried and true, they're original, so it's going to be obviously the proper set. The colors are going to be proper, so I'm just going to, for this build, go with the original decals that came with it. The water slide was a fun idea, but it's not going to work. They're just too transparent. So that's really kind of the big news on that. So I'm going to take this out, sand it, and then put the next coat of white primer on it, and then we'll check back in with you. Okay, quick update. We've got the second coat of primer on, the white, and after I got it down and it dried for a few hours, I went up and I sanded it with 500 first to get some rough patches out, and then I really finely sanded it with 1000 grit. and it is pristine. The fillets came out nice, the whole body tube is nice, and same with the nose cone. It's just about perfect. So I'm gonna let this dry overnight and let the the primer kind of gas out. And tomorrow I should be good to hit it with the blue paint. And for this project, I'm going to be using Rust-Oleum Gloss Brilliant Blue. This one, when I painted it, was a darker blue. I want to say it was called Deep Blue, something like that. But I'm going to go with the Brilliant Blue. It's a little bit lighter, but I think this more matches the face card. This one came out a little too dark for my liking. So I think the Brilliant Blue is going to be more appropriate. So this is going to be probably 2 or 3 coats of this, and then I'm going to let that dry out for a few days to completely gas out, and then we can decal it and clear coat it. So next time you see me, which is in about 5 seconds, it's going to be blue. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, there you have it. What took you 5 seconds for instantly to turn blue took me 3 days of waiting. I've noticed in the past when I put the future clear coat on, if I don't give it a few days for the paint to completely cure and gas out, I can start to get crackling in the clear coat. So I wanted to give it a few days just to kind of cure up and be completely dry. Before we do that though, I do want to glue in my shock cord mount. I'm going to go ahead and glue that in right now, and then while this is drying, I'm also going to go ahead and put some clear on the nose cone. That gives me a couple things to do. One, it gives me something to do while I wait for the glue to dry on the shock cord, but also it will confirm that the paint is dry enough to take on the future. If it starts to crack, then this is easy enough to sand off and clean because it's plastic. So I'd rather test it on the nose cone first. If it dries clear and everything's great, then I can move on to doing the body. So also while this is drying, I'm going to go ahead and get back in to do my decals. So we'll do the decals after we glue all this stuff together and clear the nose cone. So let's go ahead and get going on the glue because I want to get this set up pretty quickly. What I'm simply going to do is just put a layer of glue on the base there and put it in at least an inch, inch and a half, as far down as I can get it, so we're staying clear of the shoulder of the nose cone. So just using some white glue. And it's going to be a little messy as you smear this around with your finger. You want to make sure you get all the corners and edges, because that's where they'll start to lift first. And you definitely don't want anything lifting up because that'll catch on the parachute or anything else that needs to come out of the rocket. So make sure you get the glue completely off your finger because you're going to be handling the rocket and you don't want to get glue transferred to the paint. Okay. Now when you glue it, the glue itself will start to moisten up the paper, so it'll get a little more flimsy for you, which will help. So I'm going to use my little finger. There we go. And then just kind of press against the tube. Make sure you got clean hands. I definitely washed my hands before I started this because you don't want to transfer oils or grease or dirt to the body. Because once you clear it, it's there permanently. So let me just look down the tube, make sure everything is flat. Yeah, there's no evidence whatsoever of the shock cord mount. So I'm going to let that sit and I'm going to just hold it off to the side while I bring in my nose cone, and we're going to go ahead and put the future on it and get that drying. Okay, what I like to do is just pour it right into a small cup. Doesn't take much at all. And then I like to wipe the threads so it doesn't glue the cap on. Oops. All right, and then I just take a foam brush, and when I apply it, kind of pull it from the base to the nose. And we're going to do 2 coats, so If it's not perfect on the first coat, don't worry about it. There we go, full coverage. And then you don't want to leave it on its side though, because it'll pull up on the bottom. So you want to stand it up vertically. That way you don't get any on the nose either. Kind of tap the nose a little bit. And then just kind of set this somewhere vertically so it can dry and run down to make a nice smooth coat. So while we let this dry, I'm going to get the decals ready to go, and we'll come right back and do that next. Okay, so off camera I went ahead and cut out all of the decals, because that's just time consuming and you don't want to see that. But they're all ready to go. I've got the main Wizard title, the top stripe, and all the corner fin stripes for the lower fins. So that is all set to go. I'm going to go ahead and do the striping on the fins first, just to get them out of the way. They're a little tedious. I think this is going to be the easier stuff up top. So I'm going to kind of face the rocket away from me, and I'm just going to pull up. You want to get the orientation right on these, but you want the yellow up at the front, like so. Now, unlike water slide decals, these are pretty much one shot. There is a technique where you can, spray some water with some soapy solution in it, and that allows you to slide it around a little bit. But for something this small, I'm just gonna forego that and apply them directly. So let's just go ahead and get one. Once we get one set, then we can kind of use that as a reference for our positioning on all the rest. But it's pretty straightforward. So again, you want to make sure you got clean fingers. Wash up before you do this, because you don't want to transfer fingerprints and dirt and oil. Okay. Trying to get a better. I'm trying to hold this angle for the camera, but it's making it difficult to see myself. Bear with me, I'm just gonna have to take it off the cradle and do it by hand here. There we go. Took a little longer than I thought it would for that first one, but we got her down. Alright. And then what you can do, too, is just take a Q-tip and kind of help rub down the edges. You want to pull any air bubbles out. Make sure you get the corners down good. And then the clear coat, of course, will seal all that up for you. So let me do one more on this side, and then I'm going to do the remainder off camera, because you don't need to sit and watch me do all of these. Okay, we got all 3 fins completely covered with their decals. Good to go. Now I want to place the front stripe on next, and I want to get it up, obviously as close to the edge as I can, but don't feel like you've got to go all the way to the edge, because the blue here, if there's a little bit of a blue gap, that's okay, because it's just going to blend into the nose cone anyway. Because if you get it right up to the edge, there's a good chance that over time that can start to lift as you start working your parachute and your wadding and everything. You don't want that to lift. So I'm going to leave it down just a skosh to keep it, to keep it safe. And I'm also going to run the seam line in line with the launch lug. So I'm going to start my wrap here in line with the launch lug and then just wrap it all the way around until they meet up again. So I'm going to face the camera once again, I'm looking overhead to make it a little easier for myself. And this one you got to really be careful because you got to align it and you want to keep it straight. So I'm just going to take my time with it. In fact, what I'm going to do is, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to cut off just a little bit, maybe 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 inch, like so. And that way I can line it up, wrap it, and then once it's good, then I can seal it down. So again, I want to make sure I'm lined up with the launch lug. Make sure they're aligned. Okay, that looks good right there. So I'm going to go ahead and lay the decal down and let the rest kind of unwrap. I'm about 1/16 of an inch from the top as well. Okay. And then I'm just going to kind of squeegee out the air with my thumb as I push the wrapping out. Just kind of going back and forth, left and right. Almost there. And voila, we met right back up at the initial seam line. Perfect. And that seam is right in line with the launch lug. So there you have it. That's my technique. It works, so I'm not going to change. I hope maybe you can apply that. Just cut off a portion of it, place it, and then once you stick that portion down, it'll hold while you unwrap the rest. So anyway, that technique seems to work well for me. Hope it does for you too. All right, now let's go ahead and get the Wizard decal down. Now I'm not going to measure again. If you remember earlier when I was talking about how we do the scale dimensions from our face card, and we got our multiplier number, which was 2.29. So if you remember, I already did the dimensions on where to place the Wizard. And we figured it's going to be 53 millimeters from the base to the beginning of the W. Now, I did take a little snip of Tamiya tape. Now, is this being too exact? Probably so, but that's okay, you know. Have your perfectionist in you come out when it comes to decals, because it'll pay off dividends. So I'm just going to mark at the 53 millimeter mark. There we go. Good enough for what I'm doing. Okay, so that's what I'm going to butt the W up against. And I lay down. And I mean, it looks dimensionally, it matches the face card perfectly. So this is definitely a good technique. Let me just go ahead and wipe down real quick any possible fingerprints or anything that could disrupt the look of it. Okay. And I'm just going to kind of eyeball it, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to cut off, let's say the first, let me curl this up just a little bit so it doesn't stick till I want it to. But let's cut off the last ½ inch. Okay, and because I curled it up, it's not going to stick yet, so I can work on my placement and positioning. Again, working from overhead, you want to make sure everything is aligned and straight. Okay, looks good. I'm gonna go ahead and lay it down right at that point. So there. Okay, I got the front down. Now I can go ahead and remove this placement tape. Okay, and I'm just going to kind of push it out as the backing comes off. See that? And then voila, we've got a perfectly placed Wizard decal. There we have it. There's our completed Wizard. Next thing I'm going to do is going to go ahead and start with the Pledge Future Floor Polish. Okay, off camera, as you know, I finished the decals, but off camera I wiped the rocket down to get it free of fingerprints, any oils, greases, any dirt. So it's ready to take on the future polish again. Again, I just got my small cup with the polish in it and a foam brush. And I know the camera's not going to be able to get all of it, but I'm basically just going to, from the top down, I'm going to just go in segments. Just like so, all the way around. And then I'm going to do the fins, and I'm going to let it sit on wax paper because you just want to make sure it's not going to stick to whatever you're putting on permanently. So just notice my shot cord's falling out the bottom here. We don't want it getting caught up in the polish, that's for sure. Let's just kind of try to push that back up in there. There we go. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start this first coat. And once we do the first coat, I'm going to do the second coat off camera just because it's going to be a repeat of the same. So let's go ahead and get started. This is very, very simple. I just dab a little bit on the very tip. It doesn't take much at all. And again, you just start at the top and you just pull it down. Okay. And the foam brush will work around contours for like the example of the launch slug. Okay, a couple more. Usually I notice it takes about 6 passes to get one full time around. And then again, just a little bit, and we're just going to do the fins. Don't forget the edges. It's getting a little runny on me, which is fine. That's kind of what you expect. That's why I'm using wax paper, not paper towel or tissue paper. Fins here, and we are good to go. Okay, so there's the first coat of the polish. Gonna let that dry for at least 30 to 45 minutes, and then it should be ready to come on and take on the second coat. So I'm gonna come back after the second coat is already done. I'm gonna go ahead and hit the nose cone up with the second coat right now because it's already dried from its first coat from earlier. So we'll come back and we'll do a little close-up and we'll be done with it. One final thing we need to do before we call it complete is we need to attach the insert into the nose cone. And now that the second coat of the Pledge Future is dry, we can go and remove all the tape and kind of give a final reveal as to how this is going to look. So let's find the tape and peel it off. And the second coat is currently drying on the body. So this gives us something to do while we wait for that. So look at that nice clean line that the Tamiya tape leaves when you mask off. That is just gorgeous. So, throw the tape away. Now this is actually one of the easier steps. The clear is dry. I don't want to fumble with it just yet. But you take some clear plastic cement and you just run it on the inside lip of the shoulder. Just like that. Take your insert and you stick it in. And what I like to do is I just like to rotate it, and that spreads the glue a lot more evenly. And then just let it sit, and literally you're done. So I'm going to let that dry for a bit. Once the main body tube is dry with its clear coat, we can go ahead and tie the shock cord to this plug here, and we'll do the final reveal. Okay, the moment has finally arrived where we can tie the shock cord to the nose cone and call this project done. It's been 6 days since we started, and I'd say the majority of that time was waiting for paint to dry. And that usually is the longest and most time-consuming part of a build. Getting a build only took 1 or 2 days. Painting it took a day. But then, like I said, waiting for it to dry took a while. Now, one thing I want to point out I know it's kind of far to see, but I've got a little tail left over on the shock cord. And I want to snip it just shy of the shoulder so it not get caught up in the tube. So let me grab my scissors and cut it down to about 1/8 of an inch. There we go. So there we go. And we'll just feed the cord down the tube. Now, before I would ever attempt to fly this, I would also put a little dab of wood glue or white glue on that knot just to help keep it from slipping and coming out. But for now, for what we're doing, that is good enough. There, slide the nose cone in, and there you have a completed Wizard. I really could not be more satisfied with it. It came out great. It was a fun project, and just a couple things to point out. If you recall, the decals, it didn't work out the way I intended. I wanted to work with some homemade decals that I'd made, some water slides, because they lay down a little thinner and there'd be less of a ridge when you feel the edge with your fingers. And then with the clear coat, there'd be nothing. However, the transparency of the water slide was just too great, and the dark blue backing was bleeding through the color, and it was just really drowning out both the yellow and the pink. So I ended up having to go with the adhesive back that came in the kit, but not a problem. I showed you how I wrap it around to get it straight. I think the hardest part was getting the little decals put on the fins, but that's fine now. So all in all, it was a fun build, and remember, this is only part 1 of 2. The following video is going to be the building of the Vintage Wizard. Now, I'm going to have to abbreviate the building video because the building of it is identical to this one. The only changes are going to start to occur when I start painting it. It's going to be a totally different paint scheme and decal. But the build itself is going to be identical, so I still want to capture it on video and I'll talk you through it, but I won't get as detailed and in depth on the build itself. So that wraps up this video for Wizard Part 1. Hope you can catch the second one, and that should be, again, maybe a week out. Once I start building and painting, it'll take another week or so to get it released. But thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and we will see you on the next video. God bless. Bye-bye.